Have you ever wondered what it takes for a man to abandon everything he thought he knew about his life? In the unforgiving Arizona territory of 1887, where the sun scorches the earth and survival depends on strength and solitude, one cowboy's journey would prove that sometimes the most powerful force in the world isn't a gun or a horse. It's the courage to open your heart when you least expect it. This is the story of Eli McGraw, a man running from his past, who discovered that some encounters by a desert river can change the course of two lives forever. What he found that day wasn't just a crying girl. It was his destiny as a father, protector, and the kind of man he never knew he could become. But before we begin, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us where you're listening from. The Arizona sun hung mercilessly overhead as Eli McGraw urged his weary horse, Thunder, toward the distant line of cottonwood trees that promised water. 3 days of hard riding through the Sonoran Desert had left both man and beast desperate for relief. Eli's weathered face, bronzed by years under the relentless southwestern sun, showed the exhaustion that came not just from travel, but from a soul trying to outrun its demons. At 32, Eli had spent the better part of a decade drifting from ranch to ranch, town to town, carrying nothing but his saddle, his Winchester rifle, and memories he wished he could bury deeper than any grave. The letter in his saddlebag, now 3 weeks old, had brought news he dreaded. His younger brother Tommy had been killed in a saloon fight in Tucson. Eli was the last McGraw standing, and the weight of that solitude pressed heavier on his shoulders than the desert heat. Thunder's ears perked up as they approached the Verde River, the sound of flowing water a sweet promise after days of dust and silence. But as they crested the small rise that led to the riverbank, another sound reached Eli's ears, something that made him pull sharply on the reins. Crying. Soft, heartbroken sobs that seemed to echo across the water like a mourning dove's call. Eli dismounted quietly, his hand instinctively moving to the Colt .45 on his hip. In this territory, you never knew what kind of trouble might be waiting by a water source. But as he approached the cluster of rocks near the river's edge, weapon ready, what he saw made him freeze in place. A young woman sat hunched beside the flowing water, her long black hair falling like a curtain around her shoulders as she wept. Her dress, a beautiful doeskin garment decorated with intricate beadwork, marked her immediately as Apache. She couldn't have been more than 18 or 19, and even from a distance, Eli could see the gentle curve of her belly beneath the soft leather. She was pregnant alone, and crying as if her heart had shattered into 1,000 pieces. For a long moment, Eli stood motionless, his mind racing. The smart thing, the safe thing, would be to mount up and ride away. Relations between whites and Apaches in this territory were strained at best, deadly at worst. Getting involved could mean trouble he couldn't handle. But something in the girl's posture, in the raw pain of her sobs, rooted him to the spot. Slowly, Eli holstered his weapon and stepped into the clearing, making enough noise that she would hear him coming. The young woman's head snapped up, fear flashing in her dark eyes as she saw him. She scrambled backward against the rocks, her hands protectively cradling her belly. "Easy now," Eli said softly, raising both hands to show he meant no harm. "I'm not here to hurt you, miss." The girl stared at him with wide, frightened eyes, clearly not understanding his words. She spoke rapidly in Apache, her voice trembling with panic. Though Eli couldn't understand the language, he recognized the universal tone of someone pleading not to be harmed. "I don't speak Apache," Eli said gently, taking a careful step closer. "But I can see you're in trouble. Are you hurt?" The girl shook her head frantically, continuing to speak in her native tongue. Tears streamed down her face, and Eli felt something twist in his chest at the sight of her distress. He'd seen plenty of suffering in his 32 years, but there was something about this young woman's pain that cut right through his carefully constructed walls. Eli knelt down about 10 feet away from her, making himself less threatening. "My name is Eli," he said, pointing to himself. "Eli McGraw." He repeated the gesture several times until recognition dawned in her eyes. She pointed to herself with a trembling finger. "Chenoa," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of the flowing river. "Chenoa," Eli repeated, and saw the smallest hint of relief in her expression. That's a pretty name. He gestured toward the river. Water. Agua. He pantomimed drinking, and she nodded quickly. Standing slowly, Eli walked to the river's edge and filled his canteen, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening. When he offered it to her, she hesitated for a long moment before accepting it gratefully, drinking deeply. As she drank, Eli got his first clear look at her face. Even with tear-stained cheeks and frightened eyes, she was beautiful. But more than that, she looked utterly lost. The beadwork on her dress was exquisite, suggesting she came from a family of some standing. Yet here she was, alone and terrified by a desert river. When she handed back the canteen, Eli noticed her hands were shaking, not from fear now, but from exhaustion and what looked like hunger. He retrieved his saddlebags and pulled out some jerky and hardtack biscuits, offering them to her with the same gentle gestures. Chenoa looked at the food with obvious hunger, but shook her head, speaking again in Apache. This time, her tone was different, sad rather than fearful, as if she were explaining something important. Eli frowned, trying to understand. He pointed to the food, then to her, then made eating motions. She shook her head again, this time placing both hands on her swollen belly and speaking more firmly. Understanding dawned on Eli like sunrise breaking over the mountains. She was worried the food might not be safe for her baby. In the harsh desert, many plants and even some prepared foods could cause problems for pregnant women. "It's just dried beef and plain biscuits," Eli said softly, though he knew she couldn't understand the words. Instead, he took a piece of the jerky himself and ate it, then broke off a piece of biscuit and did the same. He patted his stomach and nodded, then offered the food to her again. This time, Chenoa accepted it, eating with the careful hunger of someone who hadn't had a proper meal in days. As she ate, Eli found himself studying her more closely. The beadwork on her dress was indeed beautiful, but he noticed it was torn in several places, as if she'd been traveling hard through rough terrain. Her moccasins were worn through at the soles, and there were scratches on her hands and arms from thorns and rocks. Whatever had driven her to this river, she'd come a long way and left in a hurry. As the afternoon wore on, Eli made no move to leave. Instead, he settled himself on a nearby rock, keeping a respectful distance, while making it clear he wasn't abandoning her. Gradually, Chenoa's fear seemed to ease, replaced by a watchful curiosity. When he offered to refill her canteen, she nodded gratefully. The sun was beginning to sink toward the western mountains when Chenoa spoke again, this time in a mixture of Apache and broken English. "Baby come soon," she managed, her hands resting on her belly. Eli felt his heart skip. "Soon? How soon?" She held up her fingers, first 5, then 2 more. 7. Whether that meant 7 days, 7 weeks, or something else, Eli couldn't tell, but it was clear the birth wasn't far off. "Where's your family?" he asked gently, knowing she might not understand but needing to try. "Your husband." At the word husband, Chenoa's face crumpled, and fresh tears began to flow. She spoke rapidly in Apache, her voice filled with pain and anger. Though Eli couldn't understand the words, the emotion was crystal clear: betrayal, abandonment, heartbreak. As darkness began to fall, Eli found himself faced with a decision that would change his life forever. He could give the girl some supplies and ride away, leaving her to whatever fate awaited her in the desert. It would be the practical choice, the safe choice. Or he could stay and accept responsibility for whatever consequences that choice might bring. Looking at Chenoa, so young, so vulnerable, so utterly alone, Eli realized the decision had already been made. Maybe it was the memory of his own mother, who died bringing him into the world. Maybe it was the guilt over all the times he'd walked away from people who needed help. Or maybe it was something deeper, a recognition of a kindred spirit who'd also been abandoned by the world. "I'm not going anywhere," he said softly, not caring that she couldn't understand the words. The tone would be enough. Under the star-filled Arizona sky, beside the gentle sound of the flowing river, 2 lost souls found each other, and Eli McGraw began the journey that would transform him from a drifting cowboy into the father he never knew he was meant to be. Dawn broke slowly over the Verde River, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that reflected off the water like scattered jewels. Eli had barely slept, keeping one ear open for any sounds that might indicate danger, whether from wild animals, hostile riders, or Chenoa herself if her fear returned during the night. But the young Apache woman had slept peacefully, curled up on the blanket he'd offered her, one hand always resting protectively on her swollen belly. In sleep, the lines of worry and fear had smoothed from her face, and Eli found himself marveling at how young she really was, probably not much older than his youngest sister would have been, if she'd lived. As the morning sun grew stronger, Chenoa stirred, her eyes opening with the cautious alertness of someone accustomed to danger. When she saw Eli sitting by the dying embers of the small fire he'd built, she seemed surprised that he was still there. "Buenos dias," Eli said softly, remembering some of the Spanish he'd picked up during his years in the Southwest. Many Apache spoke some Spanish along with their native tongue. Chenoa's eyes widened slightly, and she responded in Spanish, though heavily accented with Apache inflection. "You stayed." "I said I would," Eli replied in Spanish, relieved they'd found a common language. His Spanish wasn't perfect, but it was functional. "Are you feeling better?" She sat up slowly, her hand pressed to her lower back. "See a little. The baby." She paused, searching for words. "Moves much in the night." Eli felt a strange flutter of emotion at her words. He'd never been around pregnant women much. Ranch life didn't offer many opportunities for that kind of domesticity. "Is that normal?" A small smile crossed Chenoa's face, the first real smile he'd seen from her. "See, yes, normal. The medicine woman says active baby means strong baby." "The medicine woman," Eli repeated thoughtfully. "Your village's healer?" The smile faded from Chenoa's face, replaced by the same look of pain he'd seen the night before. "I have no village now," she said quietly in Spanish. Over the next hour, as they shared a simple breakfast of jerky, biscuits, and coffee brewed over Eli's rekindled fire, the story came out in pieces. Chenoa's Spanish was limited, and she often had to mime or draw in the sand to explain herself. But gradually Eli began to understand the tragedy that had brought her to this river. She had been married, arranged by her family, to a man named Nailnish, a warrior from her band. But Nailnish had another wife, an older woman who had given him no children. When Chenoa became pregnant, the first wife had grown jealous and bitter, turning the other women against her. She said. Chenoa struggled for the Spanish words, finally drawing symbols in the sand. She said the baby was cursed, that I brought bad medicine to the band. The situation had worsened when a raid by Mexican soldiers had gone badly, resulting in the deaths of several Apache warriors. The first wife had convinced many in the band that Chenoa's pregnancy was to blame, that her cursed baby had brought misfortune to their people. "And your husband?" Eli asked gently. "Nailnish, did he defend you?" Chenoa's face hardened, and she spoke a string of words in Apache that clearly weren't complimentary. In Spanish, she added, "He chose her over me, said I must leave until the baby comes, and then we would see if the child lived without bringing more bad fortune." Eli felt anger building in his chest. "He threw you out while you're pregnant." "See," Chenoa whispered. 3 days ago, I walked far to find water, to think what to do." She looked down at her belly. "But there is nowhere to go. No family will take a woman with cursed baby." The injustice of it struck Eli like a physical blow. Here was a girl barely out of childhood, carrying a baby that should have been celebrated and protected, instead cast out by the very people who should have cared for her most. "There's nothing cursed about you or your baby," Eli said firmly in Spanish, then repeated it in English when he wasn't sure his Spanish was clear enough. "Nothing at all." Chenoa looked up at him with eyes that held both hope and skepticism. "You do not know Apache ways. You do not understand." "I understand that a pregnant woman shouldn't be alone in the desert," Eli replied. "I understand that any man who abandons his wife when she's carrying his child isn't much of a man at all." Something shifted in Chenoa's expression at those words. For the first time since he'd found her, she really looked at him, not with fear or wariness, but with curiosity. "Why do you help me?" she asked quietly. "I am Apache. You are, what is the word, vaquero?" "Cowboy," Eli supplied, "and I help because it's the right thing to do." Many cowboys would not think so. Eli was quiet for a moment, staring out at the flowing river. Maybe not, but my mama raised me better than that, even if I haven't always acted like it. As the day progressed, Eli found himself making decisions he'd never imagined he'd face. Chenoa was in no condition to travel far, especially on foot, and the desert was no place for a woman so close to giving birth. But staying by the river indefinitely wasn't safe either. Water sources attracted all kinds of travelers, not all of them friendly. There's an old trading post about half a day's ride north of here, he told Chenoa in the afternoon. Fella named Murphy runs it. He's got a reputation for being fair with Indians, and he might know of somewhere safe you could stay until the baby comes. Chenoa looked uncertain. This Murphy, he would help Apache woman? He might. Worth asking anyway. Eli paused, then added carefully, that is, if you want to come with me. I'm not trying to force anything on you. For a long moment, Chenoa was silent, her hand resting on her belly, as if consulting with the child within. Finally, she looked up at him with those dark eyes that seemed to hold depths he couldn't fathom. In my dream last night, she said slowly, I saw a man with kind eyes who would help my baby find safety. When I woke, I thought it was just hope making pictures in my sleep. But now, she gestured toward him. Now I think maybe the spirits sent you. Eli felt heat rise in his cheeks. I don't know about spirits, miss. I'm just a cowboy who happened to be passing by. Maybe, Chenoa said with another small smile. Or maybe the spirits wear cowboy hats sometimes. As they prepared to travel the next morning, Eli rigged up a more comfortable seat for Chenoa behind his saddle, using his bedroll and extra blankets to cushion the ride. Thunder, his usual one-man horse, seemed to sense the special circumstances and stood patiently while Chenoa settled herself. You sure about this? Eli asked as he swung up into the saddle. We can take our time. Stop whenever you need to. Chenoa's arms circled his waist as she held on, and Eli felt a strange protectiveness settle over him like a familiar coat. See, she said softly. I am sure. As thunder carried them away from the river where their lives had intersected, neither Eli nor Chenoa could have imagined how completely their destinies had become intertwined. What had started as a simple act of kindness was about to become something much deeper, a bond that would test them both and ultimately forge them into the family neither had dared to hope for. Behind them, the Verde River continued its eternal flow, carrying with it the whispered prayers of two souls who had found each other in the vastness of the desert, and who were about to discover that sometimes the family you choose is stronger than the one you're born into. Murphy's trading post appeared on the horizon like a mirage made real, a low, adobe building surrounded by corrals and outbuildings, with smoke rising from the chimney into the clear desert air. As thunder carried his two riders toward the settlement, Eli felt Chenoa's grip tighten around his waist. It will be all right, he murmured over his shoulder, though he wasn't entirely certain himself. Sam Murphy had a reputation for fair dealing with all people, regardless of race, but that didn't guarantee he'd welcome a pregnant Apache woman with open arms. The trading post was busier than Eli had expected. Several horses stood tied at the hitching rails, and he could hear voices from inside the main building. As they approached, a grizzled man in his 50s emerged from the store, his keen blue eyes taking in the unusual sight of a cowboy traveling with an Apache woman. Well, I'll be damned, the man said, though not unkindly. Eli McGraw, isn't it? Haven't seen you in these parts for, must be 3 years now. Eli dismounted and helped Chenoa down carefully, noting how she swayed slightly on her feet. The ride had been harder on her than she'd admitted. Sam Murphy, he greeted. Good to see you again. Murphy's gaze shifted to Chenoa, taking in her obvious condition with the practiced eye of a man who'd seen all kinds of human drama pass through his doors. And who might this young lady be? This is Chenoa, Eli said simply. She needs help. Before Murphy could respond, Chenoa stepped forward and spoke in careful Spanish. Senor Murphy, I have heard you are a man of honor. I ask for nothing but a chance to work for food and shelter until my baby comes. Murphy's eyebrows rose. You speak Spanish. That's good. Easier than trying to figure out sign language. He studied her for a moment, then looked back at Eli. What's the story here, McGraw? Eli gave him a condensed version of how he'd found Chenoa by the river, leaving out some of the more sensitive details about her banishment. Murphy listened without interruption, his weathered face giving away nothing. When Eli finished, Murphy was quiet for a long moment. Finally, he said, "Come inside, both of you. Let's get the lady some proper food and figure out what's what." The interior of Murphy's trading post was a fascinating mixture of frontier practicality and surprising comfort. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with everything from ammunition to bolts of cloth, while a pot-bellied stove in the center of the room provided warmth. Several customers, a mix of ranchers, traders, and travelers, looked up with curiosity as they entered. Murphy led them to a table in the back corner, away from prying ears, and brought over plates of stew and fresh bread. Chenoa ate gratefully, and Eli noticed some color returning to her cheeks. "Now then," Murphy said, settling into a chair across from them, "I won't lie to you folks, having an Apache woman here might cause some talk, but I've never turned away someone in genuine need, and I'm not about to start now." He looked directly at Chenoa. "You can stay, at least until the baby comes. I've got a small room behind the store that's clean and private." Relief flooded Chenoa's face. "Gracias, Senor Murphy. I will work hard, I promise. We'll figure out the work part," Murphy said with a wave of his hand. "Right now, you need rest more than anything." He turned to Eli. "What about you, McGraw? You planning to stick around?" It was the question Eli had been dreading. He'd brought Chenoa to safety, fulfilled his obligation as a decent human being. He could ride away with a clear conscience, return to his drifting life, forget about the crying girl he'd found by the river. But as he looked at Chenoa, saw the hope and trust in her dark eyes, he realized he couldn't abandon her now. Not when she was so vulnerable, not when she'd come to depend on him. "I reckon I'll stay a while," he heard himself say. "If you've got work for me, Sam." Murphy grinned. "I can always use an extra hand, especially one who knows which end of a horse is which. Got a herd of Mustangs that need breaking, and my regular wranglers are getting too old for that kind of excitement." Over the next few days, Eli settled into a routine at Murphy's trading post. He worked the horses during the day, breaking the wild Mustangs with a gentleness that impressed even Murphy, and in the evenings, he found himself gravitating toward the small room where Chenoa was staying. She had adapted to life at the trading post with remarkable grace, helping Murphy's wife, Clara, with cooking and mending when her condition allowed. Clara, a motherly woman in her 40s, who'd never been able to have children of her own, had taken Chenoa under her wing like a protective hen. "That girl's got spirit," Clara told Eli one evening as they watched Chenoa teaching some of the local children Apache words for different animals. "Shame what her own people did to her." "People do cruel things when they're scared," Eli replied, though the words felt inadequate. As Chenoa's pregnancy advanced, Eli found himself becoming increasingly protective of her. When rough customers made disparaging comments about Murphy's pet Indian, Eli's hand would drift to his gun until the troublemakers got the message and moved on. When Chenoa struggled with the heat and swelling that came in her final weeks, Eli would bring her cool water and sit with her in the shade, talking about anything that might distract her from discomfort. They had developed their own language of sorts, a mixture of Spanish, English, and gestures that allowed them to communicate with surprising depth. Chenoa told him stories of her childhood, of learning traditional Apache skills from her grandmother, of the dreams she'd had for her baby before everything went wrong. In return, Eli found himself sharing things he'd never told another soul, about his family's farm in Texas, destroyed by drought and debt, about his younger brother Tommy's wild streak that had eventually gotten him killed, about the loneliness that had driven him from town to town, always looking for something he couldn't name. "You are not like other cowboys," Chenoa observed one evening as they sat watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. "How so?" "Other cowboys, they see Apache woman, they see enemy. Or they see something to use and throw away. You see person." Eli was quiet for a moment. "My mama always said you judge a person by how they treat those who can't help themselves." Guess she knew what she was talking about. "She sounds like wise woman," Chenoa said softly. She would be proud of the man you became. The words hit Eli harder than he'd expected. His mother had died when he was 12, and he'd spent the next 20 years making choices he knew would have disappointed her. But maybe, just maybe, this choice to stay, to help, to care, was one she would have understood. It was in the early hours of a September morning that everything changed. Eli was awakened by urgent knocking on the door of his small bunkroom. Clara Murphy stood outside in her nightgown, her usually calm face tight with concern. "It's time," she said simply. "The baby's coming, and Chenoa's asking for you." Eli dressed quickly and followed Clara to the back room, his heart pounding with an anxiety he didn't fully understand. Why would Chenoa want him there? He knew nothing about childbirth, nothing about babies. But when he entered the room and saw Chenoa gripping the bedsheets, her face tight with pain and fear, he understood. She was facing the most frightening moment of her life, and she wanted the person she trusted most to be nearby. "I'm here," he said in Spanish, taking her hand. "I'm not going anywhere." The next few hours were the longest of Eli's life. Clara and the post's occasional doctor, Dr. Henley, managed the medical aspects of the birth, while Eli simply held Chenoa's hand and offered what comfort he could. When the pain became intense, she would grip his fingers so hard he thought she might break bones, but he never complained. As dawn broke over the desert, a baby's cry filled the small room. Dr. Henley held up a tiny, red-faced infant with a thick shock of black hair. "You have a son," he announced with a tired but genuine smile. Chenoa's eyes filled with tears of joy this time, not sorrow. As Clara cleaned and wrapped the baby, Eli felt something fundamental shift inside his chest. When Clara placed the infant in Chenoa's arms, and the tiny boy opened dark eyes that seemed to look right at him, Eli McGraw felt his heart crack open in a way he'd never experienced. "He's beautiful," he whispered, and meant it with every fiber of his being. Chenoa looked up at him with exhausted but radiant eyes. Would you like to hold him?" With trembling hands, Eli accepted the tiny bundle. The baby was so small, so perfect, so completely helpless. As he looked down into that little face, Eli felt the last of his walls crumble. This child might not share his blood, but in that moment, every protective instinct he possessed claimed the boy as his own. "What will you name him?" he asked softly. Chenoa was quiet for a moment, studying both Eli and her son. "In my tribe, children sometimes receive names that honor those who help bring them safely into the world." She paused, then said, "I would like to call him Elias, like your name, but with Apache sound." Eli felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Elias, that's a fine name." As he held little Elias and watched Chenoa's exhausted but peaceful face, Eli realized that his life as a drifting cowboy was over. He had found his family in the most unexpected way, and he would spend the rest of his life making sure they never faced the kind of abandonment and cruelty they had already endured. The lonely cowboy who had found a crying girl by the river was gone. In his place stood a man with purpose, with responsibility, with love he'd never imagined possible. He had indeed become a father forever. 6 months after little Elias came into the world, Murphy's trading post had become more than just a business. It had become a community. Travelers passing through would often comment on the unusual but harmonious household. Sam and Clara Murphy, the childless couple who'd found purpose in helping others. Chenoa, the young Apache mother who'd proven her worth with quiet dignity and hard work. Eli, the cowboy who'd transformed from a drifter into a devoted protector. And baby Elias, who'd somehow become the heart around which all their lives revolved. The baby was thriving under the combined attention of his makeshift family. Clara had appointed herself as grandmother, teaching Chenoa about frontier child-rearing while learning Apache lullabies in return. Sam Murphy had proven surprisingly adept at making the boy laugh with funny faces and silly voices. But it was Eli who had truly embraced fatherhood with a devotion that surprised everyone, including himself. Every morning, Eli would check on mother and child before heading out to work. Every evening, he would help with feeding time, his large, calloused hands surprisingly gentle as he held the bottle or changed diapers. When Elias cried in the night, it was often Eli who would pace the floors, humming half-remembered songs from his own childhood until the baby settled back to sleep. "You know," Clara observed to her husband one evening, as they watched Eli teaching 6-month-old Elias to clap his hands, "I don't think I've ever seen a man take to fatherhood so naturally." "Especially when it ain't even his own blood," Sam replied quietly. "Takes a special kind of man to love another man's child like that." But if anyone had asked Eli, he would have insisted there was nothing special about it. From the moment he'd held Elias for the first time, the distinction between biological and chosen family had ceased to matter. The boy was his son in every way that counted. The peaceful routine was disrupted on a cold February morning when a group of Apache riders appeared on the horizon. Eli, who was breaking a particularly stubborn Mustang in the corral, noticed them first. His blood ran cold as he recognized the traditional war paint and weapons that marked them as a raiding party. "Sam," he called, his voice carrying the urgency of impending trouble. "We've got company." Murphy emerged from the trading post, his own rifle in hand, as the riders approached. There were 8 of them, led by a man whose bearing and elaborate headdress marked him as a war chief. They rode straight up to the main building, showing no fear despite being outnumbered by the various traders, cowboys, and travelers who'd taken shelter at the post. The leader spoke in Apache, his voice carrying the authority of command. Though Eli couldn't understand the words, the tone was clear. They were looking for something. Or someone. Clara appeared in the doorway, her face pale but determined. "Chenoa's in the back room with the baby," she whispered to Eli. "What do they want?" Before Eli could answer, Chenoa herself appeared, drawn by the sound of her native language. When she saw the riders, her face went white as chalk. She spoke rapidly in Apache, her voice shaking. The war chief responded sharply, pointing at her and then at the baby in her arms. Even without understanding the language, everyone present could feel the tension ratcheting up by the second. "What's he saying?" Eli demanded, his hand resting on his gun. Chenoa's voice was barely a whisper. He is brother to Nailnish, my husband's brother. He says I have brought shame to their family by living among white people. He says I must return, and the baby." She couldn't finish, but the anguish in her voice told Eli everything he needed to know. They wanted to take Elias, probably to raise him as one of their own, while sending Chenoa away in disgrace. "Like hell," Eli said quietly, stepping closer to Chenoa and the baby. The war chief noticed the movement and fixed his dark eyes on Eli, speaking again in Apache. This time, his tone was clearly threatening. He asks why a white cowboy thinks he can interfere in Apache family matters. Chenoa translated, her voice steadier now that Eli was beside her. Eli stepped forward, his posture respectful but firm. Though he couldn't speak Apache, he addressed the war chief in Spanish, hoping the man would understand. "This woman and child are under my protection," he said clearly. "They have found sanctuary here, and I will not see them taken against their will." The war chief's eyes narrowed, and he responded in broken Spanish. "Apache woman belong with Apache people. White man has no say. Apache people threw her out when she needed them most," Eli replied, his voice rising slightly. "Where were you when she was alone and crying by the river? Where were you when she walked through the desert, pregnant and abandoned?" Murmurs ran through both groups, the Apache riders and the people of the trading post. The war chief's face darkened, but Eli wasn't finished. "A real family doesn't abandon a pregnant woman because of superstition and jealousy," he continued. "A real family protects those who can't protect themselves. This woman has more family here than she ever had with you." The war chief spoke rapidly to his men, clearly angered by Eli's words. Several of them reached for their weapons, and the situation balanced on a knife's edge. It was then that Chenoa stepped forward, speaking in Apache with a strength and dignity that surprised everyone. Her voice carried across the courtyard as she addressed not just the war chief, but all his men. Though Eli couldn't understand her words, he could hear the power in them, the voice of a woman who had found her courage and wasn't afraid to use it. When she finished, the war chief stared at her for a long moment. Then he spoke, his tone somewhat less hostile than before. "What did you tell them?" Eli asked quietly. Chenoa's chin was raised proudly. I told them that I am no longer the frightened girl who was cast out in shame. I told them that I have found a family who loves me and my son not because we belong to the right clan or follow the right traditions, but because we belong to each other by choice. She paused, then continued. I told them that the man who found me by the river has shown me what true honor looks like. Not the honor that comes from following old rules, but the honor that comes from doing what is right when no one is watching. The war chief listened, then spoke again, this time looking directly at Eli. He wants to know. Chenoa translated. If you would fight to keep us. Eli didn't hesitate. Tell him I would die before I let anyone take you or Elias away from this family. When Chenoa translated his words, something shifted in the war chief's expression. He dismounted and walked closer, studying Eli with the keen eyes of a warrior assessing another warrior. In halting Spanish, he said, You would fight Apache war party for woman and child not your blood? They are my blood, Eli replied firmly. Not by birth, but by choice. That makes the bond stronger, not weaker. The war chief was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving from Eli to Chenoa to little Elias, who was watching the proceedings with wide, curious eyes. When he spoke again, it was an Apache, directed at Chenoa. Her eyes widened in surprise, and she responded with what sounded like questions. The conversation continued for several minutes, with the other Apache riders occasionally adding their voices. Finally, the war chief turned back to Eli. In Spanish, he said, Apache woman says you are good father, good protector. She says you give respect to Apache ways, while teaching white ways. This is unusual. I respect what deserves respect, Eli replied, and I love what deserves love. The war chief nodded slowly. I tell Nailnish his wife has found better husband. He will not come here again. He paused, then added with something that might have been respect. You are not like other white men, Cowboy. You have warrior heart. As the Apache riders prepared to leave, the war chief spoke once more to Chenoa. This time, tears flowed down her face, but they were tears of relief and gratitude. What did he say? Eli asked as the riders disappeared into the desert. He said that in the old stories, sometimes the spirits send help in unexpected forms. Chenoa replied, wiping her eyes. He said that my son will grow up knowing both worlds, Apache and white, and will be stronger for it. She looked up at Eli with love shining in her dark eyes, and he said that the spirits chose well when they sent me a protector with a good heart. That evening, as the trading post settled back into its normal rhythm, Eli found himself on the porch with little Elias in his arms, while Chenoa sat beside him, her head resting on his shoulder. The baby was fascinated by the stars beginning to appear in the desert sky, reaching up with tiny fingers, as if trying to catch them. Eli, Chenoa said softly, there is something I need to tell you. What's that? Today, when I spoke to my husband's brother, I told him something I have not said aloud before. She lifted her head to look at him. I told him that I love you. Not just as protector, not just as friend. I love you as a woman loves a man. Eli's heart stopped for a moment, then began beating double time. Chenoa, I know it is complicated, she continued quickly. I know that some people will not understand, but you have been father to my son when his blood father abandoned him. You have been my strength when I had none. You have shown me what love without conditions looks like. Eli was quiet for a long moment, processing the weight of her words. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. I love you too. Both of you. More than I ever thought I could love anyone. Then we are family in truth, Chenoa said simply. Not just by accident or necessity, but by choice and love. 3 months later, on a beautiful May morning, Eli McGraw and Chenoa were married in a simple ceremony at Murphy's trading post. Sam Murphy officiated, having been ordained as a justice of the peace years earlier. Clara wept happy tears as she held baby Elias during the vows. The guest list was small but heartfelt, a mix of traders, ranchers, and travelers who had come to know and respect the unusual family. When Eli slipped a simple gold band onto Chenoa's finger, a ring he'd special ordered from a jeweler in Tucson, he promised not just to love and honor her, but to raise Elias as his own son with pride and devotion. "You realize," Sam Murphy said to Eli after the ceremony, "this makes you the first white man in these parts to marry into an Apache family and live to tell about it." Eli grinned, bouncing his son, legally adopted now and bearing the name Elias McGraw, on his knee. "Good thing I've got the meanest father-in-law in the territory," he said, making everyone laugh. But as the celebration continued around them, Eli found himself thinking about the strange path that had led him to this moment. A year ago, he'd been a lonely drifter with no family, no purpose, and no hope for the future. Now he was a husband, a father, and part of a community that had embraced his unconventional family with open arms. Later that evening, as he tucked little Elias into his crib and kissed Chenoa goodnight for the first time as her husband, Eli reflected on the Apache saying she'd taught him, "We are all related." He thought it was just about nature and the connection between all living things. Now he understood it meant something deeper. Family wasn't just about blood or tradition or following the expected path. Family was about showing up when someone needed you, about choosing love over fear, about staying when it would be easier to walk away. The cowboy who had found a crying girl by the river was gone forever, replaced by a man who had discovered that the greatest adventure of all was building a life with the people you loved. As Eli lay in bed that night, listening to the peaceful breathing of his wife and son, he thought about his mother's words, "You judge a person by how they treat those who can't help themselves." He'd finally become the man she'd raised him to be. In the vast Arizona desert, where the silence was broken only by the wind and the distant call of a coyote, the McGraw family slept peacefully, safe in the knowledge that love, once freely given, creates bonds stronger than blood and more enduring than time. 10 years later, the sound of children's laughter echoed across the courtyard of what was now known as McGraw Ranch. Eli looked up from the fence he was mending to watch his son Elias, now 11 years old, teaching his younger siblings how to rope a practice post. Little Maria, 6 years old with her mother's dark hair and her father's stubborn streak, was determined to master the technique despite her small hands. 3-year-old Samuel, Sam, named for Murphy, who had become like a grandfather to them all, watched with wide eyes, eager for his turn. "Papa," Elias called, using the name that still made Eli's heart swell with pride. "Come see how Maria's getting better." As Eli walked over to admire his daughter's progress, Chenoa emerged from the house, her face glowing with the contentment of a woman who had found her place in the world. At 29, she had grown into a confident, respected member of their community, teaching other ranch wives traditional Apache skills while learning new ones herself. "The Rodriguez family will be here for dinner," she told Eli, slipping her arm around his waist. "And Clara wants to show the children her new quilting patterns." Eli nodded, still marveling at how their little trading post family had grown into something resembling a small town. Murphy's trading post had expanded into a proper settlement, with families like theirs putting down roots and building something lasting. "Papa," Elias said, coming over to join his parents, "will you tell us the story tonight? About how you found Mama by the river?" It had become a family tradition, the story of how they'd found each other. But Eli never tired of telling it, because each time he did, he was reminded of how one moment of choosing compassion over convenience had changed everything. "I reckon I could tell that story one more time," Eli said with a grin, ruffling his son's hair. As the sun set over their ranch, painting the Arizona sky in brilliant shades of gold and crimson, the McGraw family gathered on their porch for the evening ritual. Neighbors and friends joined them, as they often did, creating the kind of community that Eli had never imagined possible in his drifting days. And as he began the familiar words, "Have you ever wondered what it takes for a man to abandon everything he thought he knew about his life?" Eli McGraw knew that sometimes the best stories aren't the ones you set out to tell, but the ones that choose you along the way. In the end, the lonely cowboy had indeed become a father forever. But more than that, he had learned that family isn't something you're born into. It's something you build, one choice at a time, with courage, compassion, and an open heart. The river still flowed where they'd first met, carrying with it the memories of that life-changing day when two lost souls found each other in the vastness of the desert. And though the years had brought challenges and changes, the love that had bloomed beside those waters remained as constant and life-giving as the river itself. If you like this story, leave your opinion in the comments and, of course, leave a like and subscribe. Turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any videos. Big hug and see you soon.